This video is brought to you by Roll for Combat and The Fall of Plaguestone, an official Paizo actual play podcast. Join Prue, Cade, Brixley, and Celeste as they band together to save the village of Plaguestone from utter destruction. Listen now to The Fall of Plaguestone at rollforcombat.com. Hello and welcome to Medicine in Pathfinder 2nd Edition by How It's Played. The medicine skill is used to restore hit points, remove medical conditions, and determine the health and well-being of creatures. Let's talk about each of these in turn. We'll start with an overview of Treat Wounds. This is the game's primary means of non-magical healing and requires you to be trained in medicine to use. It takes 10 minutes of work, and you must have healer's tools in order to attempt this. After 10 minutes of tending to a creature's wounds, you roll a medicine check. The starting DC for this check is 15, and on a success, your patient heals 2d8 hit points and also completely loses the wounded condition. On a critical success, they heal 48, and on a failure, nothing happens, and on a critical failure, the patient suffers an additional 1d8 damage. Once you reach Expert Proficiency, you can choose to increase the DC to 20 and add 10 to the amount healed on a success or a critical success. With Master Proficiency, you can choose to make the DC 30 and also increase the amount healed by 30. And with Legendary Proficiency, you can set the DC at 40 and increase the amount healed by 50 on a success or critical success. Note that this is a choice you get to make. Once you reach Expert Proficiency, you don't have to roll against DC 20. And even at Legendary Proficiency, you can still roll against DC 15 if you want, but this decision needs to be declared before rolling the check. Also, if you want to be sure you don't critically fail, then pick up the Assurance Medicine feat once you hit 3rd level. As previously mentioned, it takes 10 minutes of work before you roll this check. If the result is a success, then you can declare that you will continue treating the patient for the rest of the hour. No further skill checks are rolled, and at the end of that hour, assuming nothing interrupts your work, the amount of healing the patient receives is doubled. Also note that there is a 1-hour cooldown for receiving Treat Wounds, which begins when you start treating the patient. So if you treat a patient once, you have to wait another 50 minutes before you can treat that same patient again. Likewise, if you spent the entire hour treating the patient for double the hit points, then you can immediately use Treat Wounds on that patient again because that hour is now up. This 1-hour cooldown applies to the patient receiving Treat Wounds. After the first 10 minutes of work, you can move on to treating another creature, but your first patient cannot be the target of another Treat Wounds activity even from a different healer until the hour has passed. Next, let's talk about Administer First Aid. This is the only medicine skill activity that you can use untrained and is used to either stabilize a dying creature or remove the bleeding condition. This requires 2 actions, and just like when treating wounds, you must be either wielding or wearing healer's tools. Each character is able to wear up to 2 bulk worth of tools. When doing so, they can retrieve and stow the tools with the same actions they spend in order to use them. So, for example, it would only take 2 actions for a person wearing their healer's tools to administer first aid. But if their tools are not worn, if they were instead stored, then that person would need to spend 1 interact action to get their tools out, and then 2 actions to administer first aid, and then a 4th action to put the tools away, meaning they couldn't do all of this in 1 turn. So remember, you are allowed to wear your healer's tools, which basically makes drawing and stowing them free actions. When you use Administer First Aid, you choose to either stabilize the target or stop their bleeding. When stabilizing, you roll a medicine skill check versus 5 plus that target's recovery check. Each round that a creature is dying, they must roll a recovery check versus a DC equal to 10 plus their dying value. In order to stabilize them, you need to roll a medicine check that is 5 higher than this, or usually 15 plus that person's dying value. So someone who is dying 1 needs to roll a DC 11 recovery check on their turn, and you would need to roll a DC 16 medicine check, 5 more than that recovery check, in order to stabilize them. If they were dying 3, their recovery check would be DC 13, and to stabilize them, you would need to beat DC 18, and so on. On a success, the target completely loses the dying condition and remains unconscious. The dying condition is completely removed in this case. You don't need to repeat this action to lower them from dying 3 to dying 2 and then again to lower them from dying 2 to dying 1 and so on. If you critically fail this check, then you do more harm than good and the target's dying condition increases by 1, possibly killing them. When a creature is suffering the bleed condition, they take persistent damage at the end of each of their turns and then get to roll a DC 15 flat check to see if the bleed effect wears off. You can attempt to remove this bleed condition before they suffer more damage by administering first aid. When you do so, you roll a medicine check. The DC for this check will be the DC of the effect that caused the bleed, if there is one, or a level-based DC for the monster or opponent that caused the bleed. For example, if a creature is suffering from the bleed condition because they failed their DC 16 reflex save against a vampire bat swarm's blood feast ability, then the DC of the medicine check to administer first aid and remove this bleeding condition will also be 16. If the creature is suffering the bleed condition because of a weapon attack from a 9th level opponent, and there is no specific DC listed for their weapon's bleed effect, then the DC would be the standard 9th level DC per Table 10.5, which is DC 26. Now, it's important to note that if this check is a success, then the bleeding condition is not removed. Instead, the bleeding creature gets to make an immediate DC 15 flat check against their bleed condition, the same as they would do at the end of each of their turns. You're just giving them an extra free attempt before they suffer more damage. And if you critically fail this check, then the creature immediately suffers their bleed damage instead. Also, if a creature is both bleeding and dying, then you can choose which of those effects you're going to tend to before rolling your check, and it will only apply to that condition. So you can't roll once and administer first aid for both the dying and bleeding conditions. Treat disease can be used to help a diseased creature fight off their affliction. This is a downtime activity that takes 8 hours to use, after which you roll a medicine check against the disease's DC. On a success, the patient receives a +2 circumstance bonus to their next save against that disease. On a critical success, this bonus is increased to +4. Nothing happens on a failure, but with a critical failure, the patient suffers a -2 penalty to their next save against the disease. And note that since this is a typed bonus, multiple uses of Treat Disease on the same creature do not stack. And once you use Treat Disease on a creature, you cannot use it again on the same creature until after they roll their next saving throw against that disease. You can also use the medicine skill to treat poison. This works in much the same way as treating a disease, except it only takes 1 action instead of 8 hours. You roll a medicine check against the poison's DC. On a success, the patient gets a +2 circumstance bonus to their next savings throw against the poison. On a critical success, the bonus increases to +4, and on a critical failure, the patient suffers a -2 penalty to their next save against the poison. And like with Treat Disease, once you treat someone for poison, you cannot treat them again until after their next save, whenever that may be. Those are the basics of the medicine skill, but there are also a few feats that are worth mentioning. First of those is Battle Medicine. This lets you use treat wounds by spending 1 action instead of 10 minutes, so you can use it during a fight. This works the same as using treat wounds, except Battle Medicine does not remove the wounded condition when it's successful. And once you use Battle Medicine on a target, the target is immune to your Battle Medicine for 1 day. Other people can still use Battle Medicine on them, they just can't benefit from your Battle Medicine until a day passes. The Continual Recovery feat lowers the cooldown for treat wounds from 1 hour to only 10 minutes. When you have robust recovery and succeed with Treat Disease or Treat Poison, the bonus the patient receives to their next save is +4 instead of +2. And if they succeed on that check, the result is upgraded to a critical success instead. and critical successes here usually lower the disease or the poison by 2 stages instead of only 1. Ward Medic increases the number of people you can simultaneously treat with treat disease and treat wounds. With expert proficiency, you can treat 2 people, at master you can treat 4, and at legendary proficiency you can treat 8 people at the same time. And natural medicine lets you use your nature skill instead of medicine when you're treating wounds. And at the GM's discretion, if you're in the wilderness, you can also find fresh ingredients to add a +2 circumstance bonus to your treat injury checks as well. I would encourage anyone interested in focusing on the medicine skill to check out the medic archetype, and those interested in focusing on natural medicine to check out the herbalist archetype. Both of those can be found in the Advanced Player's Guide. Before we close, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of my patrons. These videos would not be possible without their continued generosity and support. Members of the How It's Played Patreon community receive special benefits like exclusive content and getting to vote on the topics I cover. If you would like to support this channel and help it grow, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing and clicking the bell icon so you get notified when new videos release. And I can always be reached through Twitter and Facebook too. Thanks for watching, take care, and happy gaming!